Hello everyone, my name is Motiejus Valiunas, and today I'm going to tell you about symmetries, about what they are and why do we study them. And I'm also going to talk about three-dimensional symmetric objects, which are called polyhedra, and how we can use these things to study viruses. Okay, so let's start. This lecture consists of two main parts. On the first part, I'm going to tell you about symmetries on a plane. I'm going to tell you about what are these symmetries and where do they appear in nature or in human-made objects. And after that, I'm going to tell you about symmetric shapes in space, in the three-dimensional space that we live in. And in there, I'm going to tell you what kind of different symmetries we have and what kind of objects have those symmetries. So the first question, perhaps, that you may ask is, what is symmetry? So usually, many of you might have already heard the term symmetry, and it usually means some sort of repetitive structure that makes an object nice or visually appealing. And in nature, you can see many examples like those shown here. But in mathematics, we have some precise version of symmetry, some precise definition, and we can use this definition to describe all these objects that you can see here. So let's start with this definition in mathematics. So we will start with two-dimensional symmetries, which are symmetries on a plane. And on a plane, a symmetry of an object on a plane, so a two-dimensional object, is a transformation that leaves the object unchanged. So if you have something placed on a table and you move the thing that you have and it doesn't change at all, then you can say that what you did was a symmetry of that object. So for instance, one can think about symmetric shapes like polygons. So here you can see a triangle, an equilateral triangle with all sides of the same length. And you can also see a square. So we can think about what can we do to these objects that doesn't change them, doesn't change how they look like. So we can start with rotations. This is the first type of symmetry I'm going to tell you about. Some specific rotations can be used on a triangle or on a square so that your triangle or square doesn't change. For instance, we can rotate a triangle by 120 degrees. That means if you have, say, a cut out triangle on your table, you put a finger in the middle of this triangle and to use another finger to rotate your triangle 1/3 of a turn, that's 120 degrees, you'll see that in the end, you'll end up with exactly what you started with. Or another example for a square is when you can do the same thing for a square, just rotating it by 90 degrees. So that's 1/4 of a turn. And again, you will see that you will end up with the square you started with. Or you can rotate a square by 180 degrees. That's a half turn. And you can see, again, you'll move this vertex, for instance, over here to this vertex over here. But since these vertices are the same, they are indistinguishable, you will not see any difference. What you cannot do, for instance, is rotate a square by 120 degrees, what we did for a triangle. So here you can see that if you take a square and rotate it 120 degrees, you will end up with some twisted version of the same square, which will be different from the one that you started with, that you see in yellow. So not all angles are allowed here, and in particular, the fact that we can rotate a triangle by 120 degrees but not a square tells us that triangle and a square have different symmetries. So that's about rotations. Another type of symmetry is called a reflection. So a reflection just flips your object the other way around. So if you had something placed face down on a table, when you flip it, now it will be face up. And in this case, we can also imagine a line going through the middle of the object, like here, so that both parts of your triangle, for instance, will look the same. The part that is on the left of the line and the part that's on the right. And in a similar way, you can reflect a square in a diagonal. So again, we can imagine a diagonal drawn in the middle of a square, and the part above the diagonal will look the same as the part below the diagonal. So these are the two main types of symmetries, rotations and reflections. And now we can think about how we can imagine them, what different shapes we have to these symmetries, and in particular, how we can combine rotations and reflections and if we can have shapes which have one but not the other. For instance, if we have a pentagon, we can see that it is a regular polygon, the same as a triangle and a square you saw before. So we can have both rotations and reflections. So we can imagine a line going in the middle of the pentagon, and we fix this line. So we put our fingers on this point at the top and this point at the bottom, and we flip the pentagon around to swap the yellow part and the green part. And we can also have rotations, which is a rotation by 72 degrees in this case, by 1/5 of the turn. There are shapes which have rotations but not reflections. So in here you can see some sort of pentagonal star-looking thing, which does not have any reflection symmetry, which means there is no line that divides the shape into two identical parts. But we can have rotational symmetry, which is, in this case, just rotation again by 72 degrees. Or another example is this triangle, which in this case is not equilateral. It has two sides of the same length, but the third side is longer. So we cannot rotate, in this case, the triangle and get the same triangle, but we can reflect it in a line again. And we can see that if we draw a line in the middle, then the left side will be the same as the right side, and we can swap the left side and the right side. On the other hand, there are shapes which have no rotations or no reflections at all. So like this third type of the triangle, and we say that this shape is asymmetric, so it has no symmetries. So let's come back to the pictures that I showed you before. Now we can see that these objects that we earlier claimed as symmetric, we can now quantify this and say exactly how they are symmetric and describe the symmetries precisely mathematically. So this bird that you see in the first picture has the same symmetries as the triangle. In particular, it has only one symmetry, which is reflection in this axis. So if we take this bird, or rather the picture of the bird, we can swap left wing with the right wing, and the bird will look more or less the same. On the other hand, we can have this spiral-looking thing, which has only rotational symmetry, so we cannot reflect it. And in biology, this is what's called chiral object. So we cannot reflect it, but we can rotate it 1/5 of a turn, so it has the same symmetry as the starry-looking pentagonal thing that I showed before. So in particular, we can have objects like this clover, in which case we can both rotate and reflect it. So it has symmetries of a polygon, and in this case, we have 4-leaf clover, so it has the symmetries of a square. We can rotate it by 90 degrees, and it doesn't change. We just move this petal to this petal, or we can flip over, again, just the picture, not the clover itself maybe, but if we flip the picture, then we can see that it doesn't change. Or there are some starfish which have pentagonal symmetry. So the difference between the plant that you see on the top right and the starfish on the bottom right is that starfish also has reflections that you can do to them. So you can reflect a starfish, say, in this line. And in biology, these things are important in what you study. You can define what it means for an animal or a plant to have, say, radial symmetry, which are symmetry of these 3 types that you see here of the 2 plants and the starfish. And they can tell you something about the animal, something about what other animals it is related to, for instance. Okay, so let's look at some other symmetries. And some other symmetries exist not only in nature, but also in human-made objects. For instance, if you go to a church and you look up, you can see a roof that looks something like this. So on one hand, symmetries are abundant in nature, but on the other hand, humans also find them appealing and produce, say, symmetric objects, symmetric architecture, and things like that. And as an example, the methods that I can use to construct some nested structures can produce, again, some nested structures with symmetries. And here you can just see arrangement of points with pentagonal symmetry. So that is all about 2-dimensional objects. But in 3 dimensions, we can do many of the same things. So in particular, we can rotate and reflect in the 3-dimensional space. And we can see what we get with these things. So imagine you have a 3-dimensional object. So an example here I have shown is a Rubik's Cube. And if you ignore the colors that are on the faces of the Rubik's Cube, you can then think about what you can do, how you can rotate your cube or do something like that, so that it doesn't change. It maybe just changes the colors, but doesn't change its position. So in mathematics, we would like to think about idealized objects. So we think about an ideal cube, and what can we do to this cube to keep it in place. We can start by rotating. Instead of rotating around a point, what we did in 2 dimensions, in 3 dimensions we rotate around an axis. That means around a line. And we can think about it as a rotation of the Earth. We know that it rotates once every 24 hours. It rotates around its axis. So here, for instance, for a cube, we can take midpoints of 2 opposite faces, and if we put our fingers in these midpoints of 2 opposite faces, we can rotate the other parts of the cube by 90 degrees. That's a quarter of a turn, and we get the same cube. Or we can take 2 opposite corners of a cube and rotate it 1/3 of a turn by 120 degrees. So we can have various rotations of a cube, but we can also have reflections. In 3 dimensions, what we think about when we say a reflection, we think about a plane, sort of a mirror, going through the middle of our object. So in this example, when you look at the mirror and you see yourself, you and your mirror image sort of form a symmetric pair of objects, and a reflection in this mirror, in the sense of mathematics, it will swap you and your mirror image. We can do the same for a cube, for instance. We can swap the left and the right halves of the cube. So if you have the left face and the right face, you can swap them to make them swap places. Okay, so what I wanted to talk to you about are symmetries of Platonic solids. So here there are 5 what I call polyhedra. So you saw a cube earlier. That is just a type of a polyhedron, and a polyhedron is just a 3-dimensional equivalent of a polygon. So it has some vertices, some edges between those vertices, and some faces bounded by those edges. These 5 polyhedra that you can see here are the most symmetric in 3 dimensions. Which means basically that they all have the same arrangement when looking from either side. But these are not the only objects in 3 dimensions that we can think of. So I will classify these objects in terms of what symmetry they have. And in the case of these 5 objects, we can partition them into 3 types. One type is just the tetrahedron, which has what we call tetrahedral symmetry. Cube and octahedron, these 2 things that you can see here, they have the same symmetry. And the bottom 2 polyhedra, which are called a dodecahedron and an icosahedron, again have the same symmetry. Which means even if these objects, these polyhedra, look differently, they have the same symmetry. And that's what we care about. We only care about symmetries. these objects. So let's start with the tetrahedral symmetry. In a tetrahedral symmetry, we can rotate by angles of 120 or 180 degrees. For instance, if we pick a vertex, hold the tetrahedron from top from one of its vertices, and we rotate it by 1/3 of a turn by 120 degrees, we can see that the other 3 vertices will come back to where they were. Or if we pick on the blue point and on the corresponding blue point on the other side of the tetrahedron, so we can think about 2 points in the middle of an edge of a tetrahedron, and we rotate our tetrahedron 180 degrees, again, it comes back to where it was. And we can have various polyhedra, so that's another polyhedron which has tetrahedral symmetry. Although it looks differently, for instance, it has hexagons as faces, whereas the tetrahedron doesn't. It has the same symmetry. And as for real-life objects, we cannot see too many of them, but there are some objects like for instance, what are called pyramid teabags, maybe you have seen, which have tetrahedral symmetry. So that's about tetrahedral symmetry. Now, for a cube, we have what's called cubic symmetry, which is the same as octahedral symmetry. And we can rotate a cube by 90 degrees, 120, or 180. So for instance, as we saw earlier, if we pick 2 opposite faces of a cube and rotate around these midpoints, the center points of 2 opposite faces, we can rotate the cube by 90 degrees and it will stay where it was. Or we can or take 2 opposite corners, 2 opposite vertices, and rotate it 1/3 of a turn by 120 degrees. Or we can take midpoints of 2 opposite edges and rotate around the axis by 180 degrees. And again, we have cube and octahedron that you saw earlier, but these are not the only polyhedra that have the same symmetry. So here you can see 6 of the polyhedra with symmetries of a cube, which are the same as symmetries of an octahedron. So we can see that these objects, they are united by the fact that they have the same symmetry. Even if they look different, they can be studied in a unified way just by studying their symmetries. All right, and what about the cube? Where can we see a cube in real life? Well, I have already shown you one example, which is a Rubik's Cube. You have probably also seen dice. So dice are cubical as well. They have the symmetries of a cube if you ignore the points drawn on them. And in geology, cubes are important to study some minerals, some crystals. So for instance, we can see on the left here, we can see a diamond, which is octahedron shaped. And we can find natural rough diamonds, which are shaped like octahedra, which can tell us about what's happening inside a diamond. So if we look at it very up close, we look at it under a microscope, we can see some little atoms arranged in a cubic pattern. Here you have some other minerals which just grow in cubes. So these are also nice to look at, maybe. Or you can have minerals like this one, which doesn't look like it's a cube or any of the polyhedra that we saw earlier, but it still has the same symmetries. And that again can tell us that this crystal is similar to the other two minerals that you can see. So symmetries are in a way to study an object, even if the objects look different, the symmetries can tell us that the objects are not as different as they may seem. And lastly, I wanted to tell you about dodecahedral or icosahedral symmetry. Here the situation is similar. We can rotate now by 72 degrees if we pick middle of this pentagon, a center point of this pentagon, and we rotate around it 1/5 of a turn. Or we can rotate it by 120 degrees if we pick two opposite vertices of the dodecahedron. Or if we pick a point like this, we can rotate 108 degrees. And again, there are many other polyhedra which have the same symmetry. And they are not unified by the number of faces or by, say, the number of vertices on faces, but they are unified by the fact that they have the same symmetry. What can we see? Where can we see these kind of shapes, these kind of symmetries? So probably you might have noticed at the bottom center example, if we paint the yellow and red parts, we paint them white and black, then we'll have something that looks like a football, which has the same symmetries as an icosahedron or a dodecahedron. And we also can see some buildings. This is, I believe, a building of a science museum in Vancouver, which has the same symmetries as an icosahedron. Whereas in nature, we can see several types of objects that have icosahedral symmetry. On the bottom left, you can see here an animal, some sort of small single cell animal, which live somewhere in the sea. And again, they look like icosahedra with some sort of spikes on them. Or in chemistry, we can think about something called a fullerene. It is just a molecule of carbon, which has atoms arranged in this way that you can see here in the middle. And it is an important molecule. It can be used in cancer research, for instance. On the other hand, on the bottom right, we can see a virus. And this is what I wanted to tell you more about, how we can study viruses in terms of symmetries, how we can describe viruses mathematically using the icosahedral symmetry that we have. Okay, so what we do is we use nested polyhedra. We can use a method to produce polyhedra which are one inside each other, like this. So here we can see the blue polyhedron is surrounding the green one. And there is a way to relate them using mathematics. On the other hand, on biology, we have a thing like this purple thing here, which is a virus with icosahedral symmetry. How we study them? Well, we look at the vertices of our polyhedron that we had in mathematics. So that will give us just a bunch of blue points and a bunch of green points. And when we cut open both the virus and the polyhedron, we can see that the virus actually has some thickness. We can think about an outer layer of the virus and the inner layer of the virus. In the same way, we can think about the outer polyhedron and the inner polyhedron that we get in the mathematics. And we try to match these blue points to the outside of the virus and these green points to the inside. And in the end, what it gives us is something like this. So you can see that the blue points are now arranged close to the features of the surface of the virus, whereas the green points describe the inside. So it is a way to study viruses to give some sort of description, mathematical description of how they look, and in particular, how they look from inside. But it's also a way to produce nice pictures that you can see here. So for more of pictures like this, I would invite you to see in the Łącznik Gallery at the Mathematical Institute at the University of Wrocław. So this is open for the first half of October, and you could see more viruses and associated polyhedra and some more symmetric shapes. So that's all I wanted to tell you. Thank you for your attention.